Hi everybody, it's Mike Stevenson here. Welcome to Logic App Community Day. Today we're going to talk about automated testing for Logic apps. I'm based over in the UK in Newcastle. I'm a Microsoft MVP for 14 years, and I also do freelance cloud architecture, development, DevOps type work. Couple of links to my blog, and the bottom links for something called the Integration Playbook, which is where you can find a lot of information about the topic we're going to talk about today, which is testing logic apps. The agenda really quickly is we're going to look at how can I generate a test for my logic app? What does a real world test look like? And then we're going to go into some more advanced topics like checking the data and testing it from a DevOps pipeline. So if we have a quick overview of what does it look like when we're testing a logic app. So here in the middle, we've got our workflow. We then have some C# code, which is going to trigger our workflow. C# code and the test's going to then go and get the run history from the workflow. And we're going to make assertions to check the different actions executed successfully or to check that they failed. That basic principle will be repeated regardless of how you actually run the logic app and test it. So it's trigger, get the history, check what executed. Now, in the framework that's on NuGet and GitHub for testing logic apps, there's two flavors of it. So you can either deploy your logic app to Azure, and then you can test it while it's deployed to the cloud, or you can run it locally in the functions runtime on your dev machine, and you can trigger it and run it again there. So the idea of the framework is to give you the same code or very few modifications to be able to test those logic apps regardless of where they're deployed. Now, there are a couple of limitations just mentioned on the screen here. For example, the cloud connectors can't easily be mocked out when you deploy into the cloud. There's a couple of challenges with certain connectors as well, even if you're on premise. Today in the session, we're going to focus more on testing once it's deployed to Azure, and we're going to look at some of the topics. But as I mentioned, the integration playbook has a whole bunch of resources that you could go and check out where it'll go into those lower level features and talk more about testing locally. So question one is, how do we generate a test for my logic app? Okay, so here we've got in the Azure portal a real-world logic app called Ship Instruction Processor. And you can see if I open it up, the run history will display showing us what happened in our logic app. So you can see we've got all the actions that executed, and you can see we're doing some HTTP lookups here. We've got some transformations, some encoding of data, and a few other kind of common real-world type steps in your typical logic app. Now, what we can do in the sample solution, so this code sample is available on GitHub. So again, you can get the link for this from the integration playbook. But in my acceptance tests here, I've got a sample class called generate a test. And what I'm basically doing here is, because I'm a lazy developer who doesn't like writing loads of tests by hand, I want to generate them instead. So I can go to my logic app. So this one here, I could grab the run ID. So if you saw back here, we've got the run ID. I could use that ID, and I can just use these two lines of code here, tell it which logic app that I want to run, and then I can say, generate me a sample test, and then I've just got some debug lines that'll just go and do that. So I'm going to just run that test here, if you bear with me 1 second. So that's going to go and run that test, and we should see in the console window here, it's generated a whole bunch of code for us. So I can now copy that. I can just paste that into this class. So I'll just reformat that slightly. So this test here, what it's doing is it's saying, here's the logic app test manager. We're going to read a file. So we're going to have to set this sample file up in a moment. And we're basically going to trigger the logic app. And then after that, I'm going to, with this operation here, we load the run history, and then we've got these assertions down here. So an example would be this line here, which I'll just correct that. So here I'm going, go to the run history, find an action called compose convert to JSON, and then we're going to check that that action was successful, which is what this line down here is. Now, to get this test running, I've already previously got the sample message. So in the Azure portal, I could have went and got the message that triggered the logic app right at the start. So just give that a second to load up. Okay, so we can see from the run history here, this would be the trigger message down on the right-hand side here. So that would be the message I need to trigger my logic app with. Now, over in my VS Code, I've just put this sample message here, which is taken from that logic app. And then I'm just going to update the test. So here I'm just going to say this is the file I want you to read for the test input. Just put a ampersand at the start there. And then I think we need to change the type to text XML. So now here, we've now got a test that we should be able to just run that would test that that logic app worked. So I'm just going to grab a snippet to run the test, which we'll see here. So here you can see we've just copied in the path for the test that the sample input file here. So now we've got a test that we can kind of run, and it'll go and test our logic apps. So if I trigger that test, so that's going to run the test here, and you can see as we let this run through. So here we've got a test that passed, and we should be able to go into our Azure portal here, and we should see that we've just had a run execute just now, and that would have executed our test, and we would have done all the checks here to see all these different actions were successful. So you can see really with just a few lines of code here, we generated a test based on a run that we've executed previously, and then we can just repeat that run over and over again, and we've got a nice, easy to use automated test. So the next question is, what does a real test look like? So in the test we've just ran there was a simple .NET-based test, but in the real world, I also like to use SpecFlow, which adds another layer on top of my my test, which makes it easy to understand the kind of the context around what your test's doing. So if we take a look back at the code here, okay, so here in the same area in the ship instruction, we've got the SpecFlow tests, and again, in the integration playbook, there's a lot of additional information about how to use SpecFlow, but what we basically do is we separate the intention of the test, which we document in a feature file, and then the code behind for the test, which will go in a C# class. So here, you can see that I'm describing the feature that we're building. So we've got a ship instruction where the transport manager wants us to have a system that would notify that there's a rail car going to be dispatched. We'd get a notification to the logic app. It would transform the data, look up some data, and deliver a file to the end system. So this here really allows me to describe what this test actually does. So the the feature here is describing an overall set of tests, and then each different scenario would be described with a keyword here. So you can see we've got additional description about what's happened, and then we use the syntax of given, when, and then to sort of simulate the things that we're going to set up before we execute the test would fall under the given. When's really the trigger about we send a message to the logic app, and then steps are a bunch of assertions we're going to make to check what's happening with that logic app. So really all we're doing is we're just putting a human description on top of the C# code to help you understand what's going on. So some really good tests in this sample project that people can take a look at in their own time if you like. But really what's happening is when you execute this step here, it makes some code behind over here would execute. So they're given I've got a request to dispatch an order. So here I'm dynamically building an XML document that we'd use to trigger the logic app. The step where it says when we send a message to the logic app. So here I'm just sending this message with the logic app test manager. So it just triggers the logic app that you want to test. And then again, you've just got the bit where we do the assertions. You can see it's the same code from that test we generated before, the really simple test, but we've just structured it slightly differently so it falls within the SpecFlow framework, and you get that layer on top, which makes it easy to explain to people how it works. The key difference really is that when I'm looking at the original test here, you need to be a developer to understand what's going on. You do a little bit more work in that SpecFlow, and then you can sit down with your business analyst and actually spec out exactly what it is that you want to do. And then you can use this test scenario to drive the development that you're going to do. Okay, so the next question we have when it comes to testing is, can I test the data within my logic app? So we're going to use the test framework in an example here to show how you could look up the run history and find an action and find the data that was in that action to be able to check it as you expect it is. So when we do a test, we can trigger a logic app and we can check, did step 1 run, did step 2 run, and that's great. We get an idea of, did the flow go the way we expect? But what happens if you want to go a little bit further and check, does the data look like you expect it to in each of these actions? So how we would do this would be over in the code. Okay, so here you can see in the steps in SpecFlow, we've got things like we test it was converted to the flat file format. So what I'll do, I'm just going to go and find that in the code. I missed a bit here. Well, here's an example of it here. So we're checking the destination format here. So if you notice the little keyword at the top, the logic app will transform the data to the destination format. So here we've got the steps that we've usually done previously. So we've got an action called transform JSON to text. And if we go over here, you can see this is what the action we're looking for is. So we can say, if you look in the run history, we've got the input here, which is a JSON message, and then we've got the output, which is an XML message. So what we're going to do here is we're going to test firstly, was that action successful? So that's the same as what we've done previously. But now what we can do with the test manager here, we can also get the input and output messages. So if you see this line 134, we get the input message. 137, we get the output message. And there's a couple of helpers here if we want to convert it to JSON or some other format. But what I can do here is, once we've got the message body from either the input or the output of the action, we can start checking what's going on with that message. So here you can see I'm just looking for a specific keyword in that message, which tells me that data's in the format I expect it to be. I think further down here, we've got an example where I'm checking the flat file encode and action. So here you can see I'm expecting, if we go back to the portal for a moment, you see this flat file encode and action. It's quite a sort of old school flat file where it's a positional file, delimited file type format. And here I'm just sort of saying, we expect the message starts with this BOF keyword. We expect it ends with EOF and encourage to a new line. And I could also do other things with that message. I've got the body so I can parse the string and start checking that it's in a good format. So really what we're trying to do is make our test be thorough, which will lower the risk of maintaining those logic apps and changing them in the future. Okay, so the next question is about DevOps pipelines. So we can run tests in Visual Studio Code. We can run them nice and easily with either the terminal window to just use a .NET test, or we can use there's a couple of test add-ins where you can execute them from the Visual Designer on the left of the VS Code windows. Most people are going to then want to run these tests inside a pipeline for Azure DevOps. So in the sample project, you can see up at the top here, we've got a YAML file which has all of the code for running a DevOps pipeline. So we've got two jobs in this pipeline. The first one's build, package, and unit tests. So this one's about packaging up the code, and we're going to run it locally on the build agent using the function runtime locally to run those tests. So that really would run the tests in this unit test project here. You can see there's a few steps about setting up Azure right, installing the functions, core tools, and a few other things. But the step I want to look at today is the second one. So this is the one where we're going to deploy the logic app to Azure and run the acceptance tests. So this is the one where we're going to execute the tests against the deployed logic app. So here I'm going to download my build artifact, which contains the logic app zip package. And then there's a couple of other things we need to do here, which you can see they're all documented as to what we're doing and why we're doing it. But the key step is we get to this one down here, and this is going to deploy the logic app to Azure. So we've got this zip file. So you can see this is going to be a zip file here. We push it with a functions task to an app service, and it gets deployed and spins up your logic app. And then because we've had the code on the build agent by this point, I can then do a .NET test here, which is going to run the acceptance tests in this folder up on the left here. And that'll basically run all of the tests within this project. So you can see there's quite a few of them, and they'll all run against the deployed logic app and basically check that it's working properly. And then we get the test results published down here, so they'll appear in Azure DevOps. Now, if I just drag over for a minute, another window. So here I've got the pipeline that I've actually ran. So you can see this is my pipeline in Azure DevOps, and see here's the two jobs. So we've got build, package, and run tests, and then deploy and acceptance tests. So here you can see the steps that I've talked about in that YAML file where we've built the solution, we've deployed the logic apps, we execute the tests here. So you can see this is the result of each of those tests that got executed. Then we can see the publish bit here, which will end up. So over here, we should see test runs. You can see here's the runs from my acceptance test, so I can see the output, I can see the results of each individual test. So it's quite easy. Azure DevOps is doing a lot of the work for us. We're just telling it to run the tests and save them, and you get all these good things you would want to happen for your ALM process. Next up, we would like to know, can we generate documentation from my unit tests? So if you saw in the SpecFlow example, we had all this good documentation in that feature file. And the idea of taking the test a bit further than just the raw C# test and doing SpecFlow on top is that we can use that to drive some of the documentation that we're going to use. So back here, you can see we had the documentation at the top for the feature. Here I've put in a link to a markup file, so I can link from that test to where there's more documentation if you want to go lower level. This bit up here, when we generate this documentation we're going to look at in a moment, this bit would actually link to a work item in DevOps. So just by putting an attribute on the test, we can actually generate links that you could click through to go into DevOps work items. And what happens is in the build pipeline, you would notice at the bottom here, I've got this SpecFlow live and document task. So what this actually does, I'm pointing at my acceptance tests folder, and because I've got the live and document NuGet packages in there, it's going to generate a file that would get published by DevOps' build process into Azure DevOps. And then if I go into my DevOps project up here, you can see I've got this SpecFlow live and document section. Just takes a second to load up there. And that's going to look up from my last run of my tests. You can see here I can go, right, here's my ship instruction, and then the ship instruction processor test. And let's look at the green path one. So you can see over here, you've got this documentation from that SpecFlow file in a more readable format. This is the link to the MD file. So I can click on here to go and look for more info. I can click on these links. So that would open up the user story here about that particular feature. And then I can see here, it's easy for somebody, say a business analyst, to look at this documentation, see what's going on, see all of these steps, but then I can also show the test output and what I've been able to do in the code. So you would notice back in this test, so here where I've got the SpecFlow helper writing to its kind of debug write, that'll actually appear here when you go into the detailed test output. I can actually show test messages within the documentation. So the business analyst comes and looks at this and says, right, when we send the message to the logic app, this is what the message actually looks like. Here we've got the map, so we can see the input message, that JSON message, and we can see the XML that came out. Then finally, the flat file encoder, you can see the input for it, and then this was the final output message from that encoder, which is the flat file we're going to deliver to the business partner. So you can see here once we've done SpecFlow, with very little extra work, we can get this pretty documentation that can help the team sort of see how these interfaces are built and what they're doing based on a test-driven approach. Okay, so in the short amount of time we've got today, I'll give an overview of some of the cooler areas of logic app testing approach that we've been using. Hopefully that encourages people to want to go and learn more. And I said earlier, we've got the integration playbook where there's loads of videos, which I've done previously and available on YouTube. There's documentation about how to use the framework. One of the things that I often find is because it's something a bit different to what a lot of people have done, there's like this apprehension about doing automated testing. So one of the guys on our team, I asked him to give me some feedback on how his experience of getting up and running with automated testing was. So the guy here has come through the grad program. He's a very new developer, hasn't done logic apps for very long, but he's had to learn not just logic apps, he's learned things like functions, integration accounts, Terraform, and he's also had to learn all the automated testing. So here's a couple of bits of feedback of his experience. So for example, after understanding the basics, he can get, he finds that the tests give the context of what the application's doing. So the key thing is he can pick up some code that he's never looked at before. It's been developed by another developer, and he can go and look at them tests, and it helps him learn what the code's actually doing and what the intention of it is. Likewise, it's a great way to communicate between developers about how the code's working, and also it's really just giving you that confidence that when you've picked up a bit of code somebody else has wrote, or you've changed some code, you can run these tests, and it's helpful to see, not just it hasn't been run for 6 months, how do we test it, but also I've made some changes, has it broken anything? So that kind of de-risking and that communication about how the code works, I think is really important. So next steps from here, if you want to learn more, here's a bunch of links to the integration playbook. So there's info about testing logic app standard. There's also a bit of info about how you might do logic app consumption if you're doing that instead. And the sample project that I showed earlier is available on GitHub on the link here. And I hope everybody finds that really handy and would love to know more. And feel free to reach out on LinkedIn and Twitter if you'd like to chat about logic app testing. So thanks for watching my presentation today, everybody. I hope you enjoyed logic app testing. I hope everybody's having a really great day on the rest of Logic App Community Day. And tell us all which sessions you've enjoyed, which ones you want to see more about. I'm sure community members and the Logic App product group would love to know what things people would love to hear more about. Take care, everybody.